Welkom bij het 8 uur journaal. Dit is weer een pre-recording, want we hebben een speciale gast helemaal uit Canada. Vandaar dat de rest van het interview in het Frans is. Nee, grapje, in het Engels. Welkom Denis Rancourt.
Hey, I'm glad to be here, Willem. Yeah.
Good. We had some previous conversations in a discussion group, COVID for Doctors, or Doctors for COVID Ethics. And what I found fascinating is that you have such a wide view on the problem, really zooming in and zooming out on the system and then again on the details. But before we get to those details, could you please introduce or tell us a little bit about who is Denis and why are you involved in this COVID scam or COVID scandal or the exposing of it?
Well, I'm involved, to start with that, I'm involved because I can't avoid it. I mean, it's completely affecting my life and the life of everyone around me, and it's a disturbing thing, and it's totalitarianism. It's the opposite of democracy and a fair society. And so I'm involved because I have to be, and because I want to be as well. I want to change this. I want to play my role to oppose it and to resist it and to transform it and to inform people about it and to inform myself about it. I'm just really disturbed and disgusted by the whole totalitarian takeover. I mean, we have been a degrading society for a long time. I mean, they've been attacking the educational system. They've been making us stupid for decades. And what I find is that the general intelligence among people and awareness, and also among scientists, is a direct consequence of structural freedom for the Second World War, when there's a period of big growth, and to encourage that growth is to allow freedom of private enterprise and of individuals and so on. And that's what happened right after the Second World War. That's a period of great intelligence as well, because people explore, they exchange, they do all kinds of things. There are many fundamental discoveries at that time. And then as they closed down, after they ended, the US unilaterally ended the Bretton Woods Agreement and so on, and stopped the development of its allies in that way, and started really taking over and exploiting the world in a very serious way, using the American dollar as the main currency and extending its military throughout the globe and everything. As that happened more and more, society was closed down because democracy is considered a threat. And we were made progressively more and more stupid as professionals and the institutions were made to align with this project. We were just made more and more stupid. So it's been a very gradual process over decades. And we're at a point now where we're so stupid that they can actually pull this off. A completely ridiculous, insane, nonsensical so-called pandemic. And we believe it, and we're afraid for our lives, and we're terrified and so on, generally speaking. So
I would say on both sides, because there's people that believe that there's a dangerous virus, and then there's people that believe that there is a dangerous injection and very dark motives. And I think both of us are a bit more in the middle, that say, well, there is no real threat other one than you perceive by the means of the scam, and it's mostly about a scam.
Yeah, I'm not in the middle. I'm of the opinion that there was not a virulent pathogen that landed on Earth all of a sudden, that's complete garbage, that there's the usual array of viral respiratory diseases, and that they seasonally take advantage of seasons in the Northern Hemisphere. And that's accompanied with all kinds of bacterial lung infections, pneumonia, and so on. And that's always there, and it's very seasonal. Nothing special has happened. And I have made detailed studies of all-cause mortality as a function of time and by jurisdiction in many countries, many states, the provinces of Canada, and so on. And what I see is that there is, where there were no significant attacks against people, there is absolutely no anomaly in the all-cause mortality, okay, compared to the historical trend. Where you had vicious attacks in those jurisdictions, you did cause time-wise huge increases in all-cause mortality. In the US, we quantified 1 million extra deaths beyond the historical trend during the COVID crisis, so-called, that I would call the crisis, but it's a crisis of how the government responded and what they did to us. But during that period in the US, it's astronomical. We're looking at 1 million deaths that would not have occurred. And they occurred in very specific times and very specific jurisdictions, like New York right after the pandemic was announced and so on. There were about 30 states in the United States that didn't even have a first increase in all-cause mortality following the announcement of the pandemic. The only places that had that increase in Europe and Canada and the US are jurisdictions that shipped the most fragile near-death people out of ICU units into care homes and then locked them in with all the others. That was it was tantamount to murder. I mean, it was homicide, right? It was just disgusting. And
then you're talking, for instance, about Governor Cuomo in New York, who admitted doing this, shipping frail and elderly.
Even if he didn't admit it, it's all in the paperwork. All the government memos have been exposed. They expressly did this, and they did it in Quebec as well, the province of Quebec in Canada. Quebec is the province that had the biggest spike of this type, where they aggressively did this, and so on. I mean, the way that fragile elderly people were treated at the beginning of this so-called pandemic is contrary to what science was recommending. Science had always recommended that in care homes, if you want to avoid epidemics in care homes, the way to do it is to look for symptoms and to take people out to treat them outside of the care home if you develop symptoms. Okay, that is, you can find 3 or 4 of the major scientific papers that studied specific epidemics in specific care homes, and they all recommend that. That's how you handle it. That's how you prevent a lot of people in the care home from dying. And we did the opposite. We did the exact opposite. We shipped in infected people from hospitals, infected with everything they had, and we locked them in, and we isolated and stressed the residents of those care homes. And we know scientifically that psychological stress and social isolation are the 2 main determinant factors for viral respiratory diseases, whether you're going to catch it and how serious the disease is going to be in affecting you. This is the work of Sheldon Cohen, Professor Sheldon Cohen in the United States. For decades, he did these kinds of studies. Starting in the 70s, he would try to infect university students when you were allowed to do that. And he found very strong correlation with the psychological stress that they were experiencing in their lives and how little of a social network they had, so how isolated they were. And you did not need to do subtle experiments to discover this. You did not need to do a really careful randomized control trial, because the effects were huge. These are the dominant factors. And this is for young people, young students. Now, we know that the physiology of stress is much worse as you grow older, right? We know that.
And they're already more isolated. So the impact of taking that last piece of social contact away is very significant.
Of course. So I've written about this amply in several large papers that involve all-cause mortality.
About your background, because people think like, who is this? But you have published a wide variety of papers, and you're still publishing.
Yeah, well, okay, so I was a tenured full professor of physics at the University of Ottawa in Canada for more than 2 decades, where I led a big research laboratory, an interdisciplinary research laboratory. My focus in the final years when I was still there was environmental science, and that included soil science, and I was getting a lot of funding. I headed a large research group. We studied the 100 boreal forest lakes at one point to look at environmental impacts and things like that. My most cited papers are typically in environmental science, so soil science, sediments, aquatic sediments, all kinds of things like that. So, but I have written scientific papers in leading journals in many, many areas of science, everything from biochemistry, soil science, magnetism, theoretical physics, you name it. I'm a very interdisciplinary guy. And I've given keynote invited lectures at international scientific conferences 40 times, 40 or more times, recently last year as well. I was dismissed in a huge conflict I had with my employer about academic freedom, that related to academic freedom. That I felt I should be have the freedom to apply the pedagogical methods that I saw as being optimum for teaching physics. And there was a big disagreement. At least that was the pretext that was given by my employer. I was also very political at the time. Anyway, that I was dismissed back in 2009. My union defended me all the way. We went all the way we did things even up to the Supreme Court. And in the middle of that huge litigation, we finally settled a global settlement, but that it took 10 years. So in 2019, we had a global settlement to everyone's satisfaction. And that was the end of that saga with my employer, the University of Ottawa. So that in a nutshell is kind of like my professional, storyline.
COVID,
I got involved.
I think what you mentioned there is very important. So you look at much more than just one subject, and that is why you are so able to see the patterns and to see also the mistakes or the crimes, so to say. And the other part I think is also significant, because when you fight for your freedom, as you did in your employment, you also meet the system in a very different way.
Well, I believe that you cannot really learn and understand the nature of the system until you oppose it. It's only when you put yourself out there and you oppose it with your person, and you're personally involved in a real struggle, that you discover the real nature of the system and how it functions and its mechanisms and its structures. So I don't think you can learn this in books. I don't think you can read about it and really appreciate it. I think you have to experience it. And so that's how I've figured out how the system works, is to be involved in the courts. So that includes the legal system, the academic system, the political system, and so on. I have been able to get deep insight by being involved in these sometimes epic struggles that sometimes I would lose in court, sometimes I would win in court, but I sure do understand the courts now. I've been in front of something like 30 or 40 or more judges where I've self-represented myself, and I've been involved with my union in many tribunal hearings and things like that, So I really got to see the system and how the strings get pulled and what the connections are like, and just how completely unjust and what an illusion it is to think that this is, that logic and reason and information are the basis of how they run the world. It's nothing to do with that. So yeah, that's been my experience.
So what was it? What event or what fact or non-fact was it for you that you said, okay, something is wrong, or even further, now I have to speak up because this is a crisis that is perpetrated instead of a natural or a natural pathogen, but more an overreaching government?
Willem, I'm a special case because I've been speaking out forever. Every time I would see an injustice, whether it was at the university, among the students, anything I would see, I would always speak out. I was always a pain in the butt kind of thing for my department chair, for the dean of my faculty, for the vice president of the university, and eventually for the president of the university. I was always very outspoken and made my criticisms very public. I had a blog that was called U of O Watch, And I posted hundreds and hundreds of articles there about what I would discover about the University of Ottawa and its dealings. And I would do access to information requests, and I would make the documents public. And I was very critical. So I was a troublemaker. And so it's a personality trait. Some people, because of their personal experience, develop a really strong sense of dislike of anything that they perceive as an injustice. And so I take it personally. If I see a student struggling because they're being treated unfairly or something like that, I can really associate with that, and I would come to their defense. And so I worked with student associations. I did all kinds of things. So I'm one of these people that didn't have an awakening because of COVID. I was already just this type of person. And I'm also somewhat knowledgeable of medicine, and medicine as the establishment of medicine, and a lot of the false science that is called the basis of medicine. So I've written a large paper, for example, that's very critical of medicine, and that does an analysis of how cancer is treated and so on. And I did that many years ago. And so I'm intimately aware of how little we actually know, how much of what we think we know is actually most likely wrong, incorrect. And I'm talking about even in the hard sciences, chemistry and physics and so on. And so I'm someone who's very much aware of that. And so I'm very skeptical of anything that happens. And I know that medicine is a total scam. I mean, the third leading cause of death in the Western world, without a doubt, is medicine itself. And this is and when they give you statistics about cause of death, it's an extremely political process, and they never mention medicine as a cause of death, right? It's arguable whether it's the third or the second cause of death, leading cause of death. So we're talking, the pharmaceutical industry. Look, there's big money to be made and a lot of power to be acquired by selling toxic medicine to people. And toxic medicine sells better than actual good recommendations for health. And the reason is there's this psychological thing with people where they feel that they've gotten through it because they suffered. If the remedy is painful and they survive it, then that's proof that it was something that worked. There's this psychological thing where, and so as a result of that, things like chemotherapy are considered actually hard science that really helps you when you have cancer, when you have growing tumors in your body. I mean, it's just obscene when you look at the trial studies, the randomized control trials that try to find an advantage to things like chemotherapy. They're bogus, they're crap, they're just completely, it's just not of any value at all. It's just such a scam. So, these are things I've looked at, I've reviewed that literature, Professor Yanodis, for example, wrote a paper some time ago that I'm sure you're aware of, where I think the title of the paper is, most of scientific research is false. And he was referring to medicine and to these results that come from randomized control trials, right? I mean, you have to realize the reason that randomized control trials are necessary, are considered the gold standard, double blind, and so on. The reason is that the effect of the treatment is too small compared to the variability from individual to individual. That's why you have to do a randomized control trial to see you hope to see a positive average effect. It's because it's too small. If you didn't have this problem, you wouldn't have to do a randomized control trial. If it wasn't so difficult to see the benefit of the medication or whatever it is, you wouldn't have to do a randomized control trial. Everything would be obvious. You wouldn't argue about statistics. You wouldn't You wouldn't have sophisticated methods to look at error and to cover up things and so on. It would just be clear. You give this medication to someone who has all these horrible symptoms. The ones that don't get it are dying within a week, and within 2 days, those ones survive. Period. You wouldn't need a randomized control trial and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars. Yeah,
I think that is one of the problems of modern science, is that it's still a way of bloodletting. It is symptom battling or engaging the symptoms instead of the cause. And whenever they look at the cause, they find the thing they want to find. And that is very symptomatic of this whole COVID crisis.
well,
the symptoms are very generic. It is pneumonia or severe acute respiratory infection, can be caused by anything. But one thing is for certain: ill health. Ill health will give you a big chance of attracting pneumonia or respiratory infections. And then of all the possibilities, there's one culprit, the one that we didn't know. And it's what you said it before, it's such a weird way of looking at something that is nothing out of the ordinary.
It's nothing out of the ordinary. Virologists have way too much influence and way too much pull, and their mystique comes from theory, the theory of immunology and the theory of how genetics is important and all of these things. The theory is overbearing. Specialists like to talk about the mechanisms of infection, the mechanisms of the immune system. It's mechanisms. But what you should look at is epidemiology and measurable actual impacts in the population, because you can so easily fool yourself with mechanisms. Once you've understood a mechanism of how your immune system works, those are the glasses you wear. That's all you understand about the immune system, and you converse in terms of those mechanisms. But there's so much more that you don't know, and you're blind to it, because now, whereas what I think a much healthier approach and a more scientific approach is to say, look, we haven't demonstrated convincingly every detail of these mechanisms. We know there must be a lot more that we don't know. So let's stick with things that are hard facts, okay? Let's look at all-cause mortality as a function of time and jurisdiction. Let's look at epidemiology. Let's look at the progression of the disease in terms of symptoms. Let's look at, and so on, right? Let's look, if you do this, is there a result as a function of time, with what population, following specific, let's be empirical about this, and let's put aside our wonderful theories and our wonderful ideas about all the mechanisms, right? Like, the way to demonstrate that the vaccine harms people is not to explain all the mechanisms, the molecular and cellular mechanisms whereby it probably harms someone. It's very nice to do that, but that is a theoretical exercise. The way to do it is to see if the people you injected suffer serious consequences or not, and to measure that objectively and quantitatively. That is how you see if the vaccine is dangerous, and to see long-term effects, and to measure things as best you can. So it's about the methods of measurement, the methods of observation, but it's not about developing the theory of the mechanisms, which are things that you teach in the classroom and so on, you see. So I'm not saying that theoretical study shouldn't be done. I'm saying that it acquires too important a place and displaces empirical science a lot of the time in our thinking, in our analysis, okay? So
I completely agree.
Then
let's take that example of the injections. Some people call them vaccines, gene therapy, biologicals. That's not so much the debate here. But when you look at all-cause mortality, because you have done it a lot, you've written a few papers about it, does COVID pose a health crisis? And do the injections prevent COVID? Let's start with those two questions first.
Well, I think your first question presupposes something that I would not admit, that there is a COVID, in the sense that there is a specific virus whose genome has been described that is particularly virulent and is the thing causing the majority of respiratory problems on the globe during a certain period that we're calling a pandemic. I do not admit that premise. I think that's just complete fabrication. I don't see evidence for anything other than the usual, which is many viral respiratory diseases accompanied with many bacterial infections or all kinds of bacterial pathogens, lots of pneumonia, and so on. That's what I see. So in the United States, for example, I see that even the CDC admits that what they call COVID is most often accompanied by bacterial infection of the lungs, pneumonia. And so on the death certificates, they actually have COVID and bacterial pneumonia or pneumonia. And so the incidence of bacterial pneumonia, according to the CDC, is 10 times what it has been over the last decades in the COVID crisis period, okay? At the same time, they stopped prescribing antibiotics because they put out memos and the scientific articles saying, because it's COVID, because it's viral, it is an abuse of your prescription to be prescribing antibiotics. So they stopped with antibiotics. You can see the data. The antibiotic prescriptions dropped by half in the US at the same time that bacterial pneumonia went up tenfold during the COVID period. Okay, as a result of, and we can talk about why that is, and that's another question that I'd like to address. So they basically were refusing to see patients, and when they did telemedicine, they were refusing to prescribe antibiotics, and the people who died are only in the states that have a lot of poverty and obesity and diabetes. Okay, so the states that already have a low life expectancy are the pockets where these extra deaths occurred that are being attributed to COVID. All right. And so the correlations that we found in excess mortality as a function of, for example, poverty level or obesity level, the correlations are very strong. And if you lower poverty or obesity enough, there is no excess mortality. Okay, so it's not about something that spread and killed people. It's about attacking vulnerable populations by destroying their way of life, by destroying their social network, by isolating them, by oppressing them and stressing the heck out of them and scaring them to death. All right, and so the psychological stress would have had a big impact, and the isolation and everything. So you have more murders, more suicides, more everything. And the main thing that there is more of is a pneumonia. Pneumonia is a real killer. And it always has been. In the United States, it's one of the leading causes of deaths of young people, okay, is bacterial pneumonia. We forget that. And so if you have a tenfold increase in pneumonia, that's a serious thing. And if you're not treating it, that's, you're going to get a lot of deaths. And you're going to develop pneumonia under circumstances where you are stressed physiologically and psychologically. That's when you develop pneumonia and these kinds of things. One of the things that's known in medical science and in science in general is that the biggest determinant of individual health, you know what it is? I mean, all the animal studies show this. All the greatest experts that have, a broader view than just mechanisms and medicine will tell you exactly, but it's a specific kind of stress. So it's, well, first of all, it's stress caused by the dominance hierarchy. We live in a social network. In all social animals, the first determinant of the individual health of the individual animal is the amount of hierarchical oppression stress that they experience. All right. And so momentary stress as part of maintaining that hierarchy is actually good for you. If it doesn't last a long time, you have a fight, you get it resolved, you go on, it's actually good for you. It gives a burst through your immune system. It's healthy. Chronic stress, if you're completely being oppressed all the time, it's long term, you're being put in your place by constant aggression and so on. That's a killer. You're going to be sick more often, you're going to die much sooner. And so it's about stress from this dominance hierarchy. And if it's chronic, the chronic type. So for example, so it's never just a simple relationship, and stress is not just a simple parameter. For example, dominant individuals in a society can suffer a lot of ill health if they are constantly forced to protect their dominance by opponents that are attacking them in various and random ways and so on. That kind of stress chronically will also kill the leaders, the strongest in the society. So it's a complicated association, but nonetheless, in our society, it's clearly this. In other words, it's the social status that determines whether or not you're going to have a long life in general, on average, and you don't need a randomized control trial to establish that. It's very clear. The association is extremely strong. Okay.
So the only thing we are measuring now is the reaction of the governments, actually exacerbating the differences that there were already present in society. That is pretty.
Yeah. Let me jump in here, because it's not as simple as the way you said it. Let me explain. This is a really important and subtle point. It's not just that they turned a knob and exacerbated the usual things that are happening to the most oppressed in society at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Okay, it's not that simple. What they did much more than that. They made a sudden structural change in society. And when you make a sudden structural change, like you remove the social networks, you remove the work, whether even the under the table work, even the black market work, all of that work, you remove everything, because you're no longer allowed to have physical contact. You're no longer allowed to everything, right? There are no public spaces anymore and everything. When you make a huge structural change like that, you are affecting people in more than just a knob that gets turned out, because what you're doing is you're putting them, you're discontinuously putting them in a place that is different from the place where they had found their meaning and their place in society. So you have displaced them. So there are a lot of studies that show that the people who really develop a big sickness quickly and die are the people where their social environment has discontinuously been changed. So for example, someone has a career and sees their personal identity as this career, and they lose their job all of a sudden and they don't get rehired. And within years, they're dead, cancer, heart attack, whatever. Okay. So these discontinuous changes that directly impact how you view yourself and your place in the world, and whether or not you have a place in the world, those are deadly changes. And so they did that to the people who were most on the edge in terms of health. And they did it in a big way. So what we see, Willem, and it's very stunning in the all-cause mortality, as soon as the pandemic was announced on the 11th of March, 2020, and they said, we're all going to die, and there's this terrible virus and everything, and we're closing everything down, and you're in lockdown from now on, and you're this and you're that, and everybody wear a mask, and you can't have contacts with each other, and you're all toxic people spreading this terrible thing and all. As soon as they did that, all-cause mortality in every jurisdiction that we studied went up discontinuously and stayed high for the entire period. And you can see it, even though it's difficult to detect in terms of the total. The more sensitive view of it is if you do all-cause mortality by age group. So for example, in Canada, where it's hard to see and you don't detect any measurable change in total all-cause mortality, per cycle year or per calendar year. You don't detect it, and I can show graphs about that. Nonetheless, in the younger age groups, you see an increase compared to what their baseline would be historically. And it stays high, okay? And that is true, especially in the United States, because the United States had many large pockets of very vulnerable populations. And that's where they really, among the Western countries, that's where they really killed the most people. I said 1 million. 1 million is our quantitative value. So in the United States, what happens starting right at the beginning of the pandemic is that all the young age groups were dying way more than they normally would. So I'm talking up to 44, 44 years and below, you have this sudden increase like that. It's incredible. And that's very visible in the United States. So this is not a viral respiratory disease. This is a structural change in the society, an attack against people that is completely demolishing how people see themselves, their utility in society, their jobs, everything, how they operate day to day, and it's causing all the young age groups to be killed much more. I put a graph on Twitter that shows the relative change in mortality in the United States since the COVID period was announced compared to the previous year over the same number of years. And you can see my histogram. So the youngest people, I think it was 0 to 4 years old, there's only a 2% increase. The next age group, there was is the biggest, up to 44 years old, is 40% on average more than they would normally be dying in that period. 40% more. And then you have this histogram. So it's typically 40, 30, 35, and so on. So the elderly people, who are the most that died in quantity because they're the most fragile and there's a lot of them, in terms of per age group, what you die of and how many die, it's not more than the younger people in that period. This is not a viral respiratory infection. This kind of situation where young people are killed in an important way, the last time that it occurred was 1918, the so-called Spanish flu. The so-called Spanish flu was not a viral respiratory disease. It's been shown by 3 or 4 high-quality scientific studies that virtually everyone who died had an important bacterial lung infection. Okay. You need bacterial lung infections will kill indiscriminately all age groups. Of course, it's co-happening with all of the usual viral respiratory diseases, but you need it to be able to come up and to be able to kill people. And that happens like in 1918, right after a war. You're still in the exploitation of people by the growing industry. Workers are in horrible states. They're coming back from the war and they're either jobless or in terrible jobs, and so all the social conditions of the time and the discontinuous change, especially for young men in 1918, just after the war, in terms of what is their place in the world. What is the purpose of their life? That discontinuous psychological change, all the conditions were such that bacterial infections killed a lot of people, millions, at a time when there were no antibiotics. Okay, before antibiotics were developed and discovered. So what we have during the COVID crisis is a recreation in the United States of what happened in 1918. We have a recreation. We have no more use of antibiotics, great decrease in the prescription because we're told that it's not bacterial. We have conditions such that bacterial infections with co-viral infections are going to be very prominent, are going to take over in the fragile populations whose social networks and the entire environment has been structurally transformed. Okay, we have recreated 1918 in the United States during the COVID crisis period. That's why you got 1 million deaths in the United States. Okay,
so the recreation was done by a large extent via media and social media. Now, I just found out that both my Twitter accounts are suspended indefinitely. Did you meet the same censorship?
I have so much experience with legal battles that my tweets are legally intelligent. Okay, I push the limit, but I know what the limit is that I could defend this in court. So I think that anyone at Twitter who evaluates my tweets knows that. Okay?
Well, I think so too, but my tweets or my accounts were taken out very likely by the intelligence agencies. So it has nothing to do with any legal ramifications. But have you experienced?
Have I experienced it? Okay, so I have been removed from ResearchGate, where I had a large account. All my research papers were there. I had a lot of followers, and people didn't like my recent articles that were reviewing the science of vaccines, for example, the all-cause mortality. I had one article on ResearchGate that reviewed the science, all the science on face masks, showing that none of the randomized controlled trials with verified outcome in the lab showed any benefit from wearing a mask. And this was unanimous across everything that had been done scientifically. That article, that's really what made me known in the COVID kind of period of alternative skeptics. And it was read on ResearchGate 400,000 times before they took it down. And it was posted on every major website, and they took it down, and I challenged them, and they said that they ultimately, the CEOs told me directly, we took it down because it was being read too much and it was being posted on all these websites, so we took it down. Okay, and then later I kept writing these papers and posting them on ResearchGate, and there was one where I was critical of vaccines and where I explained all the science that explained all the mechanisms whereby vaccines could cause harm. And some people had a heart attack when they saw that on ResearchGate. And so my account was taken down permanently from ResearchGate. Okay.
But it's so ironic that ResearchGate is supposed to bring the inconvenient truth.
Yeah, it's supposed to be a scientific venue. And these were all scientific articles that all they did was review the scientific literature and explain it and comment on it. There was nothing, there was no conspiracy theories, anything like that. It was just purely, here's the science, here's the peer-reviewed science about face masks, and here's the table of all the papers that I've reviewed, and here's what they say. And then
you would expect a debate about the content. Instead, you're being silenced.
Yes. So I was removed from ResearchGate, and I was removed in the same way and for the same kinds of reasons from LinkedIn, where I had a professional account. I had many links through various professionals and everything. That was just taken down. They are just not about debate, not about any. They are just like the World Health Organization guidelines. That's it. That's all. Nothing matters for them. So LinkedIn is that kind of an outfit. I was removed from that, but I have not been taken down from Twitter yet. I have not been taken down from Facebook yet. So I have a lot of followers there. I mean, on Twitter, I have, 55,000 followers. And they did remove a post recently that was, according to them, against, dangerous because it was against the World Health Organization guidelines. And it was a whole string, and they removed it. And so I went on and challenged it. I wrote one little paragraph using my legal knowledge, knowing how to word it so that they would understand what I was talking about, and basically said, you're wrong you're completely wrong. I'm actually protecting the public. I'm not putting anyone at risk here. And it's based on science. And I think you made a mistake. And within 2 hours, they said, we're sorry, we made a mistake. We've completely normalized your account. Everything's back to normal. Within 2 hours.
Well, I can only hope for that kind of reaction. I took it up with my lawyer, so let's see where that goes.
Yeah. You maybe, I don't know why people are actually. It's a bit of a mystery as to why they haven't closed down my account. Okay, I mean, I do have a lot of followers in many spheres. I am careful, and you know what? I am willing to take them to court. And maybe they feel that, maybe they can see it, maybe they know, my litigation history is not a secret. It's all over all the databases on legal battles, the official government databases. You can find 50 or more legal decisions that I'm involved with, in everything from tribunals all the way up to making requests to the Supreme Court. Okay, so I'm a litigious person, and maybe they know that. Okay, maybe they understand it. So and I know what the legal arguments would be. I think I know a lot of them, and I know a lot of lawyers, and I'm so
but
who knows, maybe
besides being well prepared, isn't this the craziest thing, that we scream for a debate, we give all the sources, the links, the research, and we say, well, can we please debate this? No, I'm not even asking you to admit that I am right. I'm just open for a debate. And only by doing that, we get censored.
Absolutely. So do you think that it was a specific tweet that got you banned from
Oh,
Twitter?
absolutely. Yeah. It is about the World Economic Forum. One of the operatives of the World Economic Forum is part of our government. Now she is becoming Minister of Finance. So her home address, which she already expressed, and there was a lot of special, so it was the least secret address in Holland, and somebody submitted a request for the registry of that address, and they got it in return, like this is shielded information. So I put this on Twitter. Why is this information shielded? And that brought a whole explosion on Twitter, and Twitter took off the accounts. Yeah. So maybe we pushed on a very sensitive subject. Now, why is it relative? If a foreign entity owns property in which a Minister of Finance lives, that could be a problem, to be honest.
Yeah. You touched on absolutely, there is an absolute red line that they're very careful about, that they really enforce in a big way. And that is anything that would suggest or enable the public to take things in their own hands. Okay, so if you, another time, the only other time that a tweet of mine was removed is when I suggested that a politician in Ontario be tarred and feathered. Okay, so you have an image of people actually mobbing, physically mobbing a politician to tar and feather them. Of course, it's an expression. Of course, I was not making a death threat. I was not doing anything illegal. It's obviously a historical reference to tarring and feathering.
In Holland, we already had some people sentenced to jail for saying less than you said on Twitter, actually.
Yeah. So this is the establishment system that controls the power structure. This is an absolute red line, because it creates this notion that people could actually physically take things into their own hands and actually physically overthrow, whether they be police stations or whatever, and go to politicians' homes and all these kinds of things. So that is, they absolutely need to prevent that, because that is the spark, that is the catalyst to what could be a civil war, or what could be physical unrest that actually threatens the system. Okay, so that when you any time that they feel that you're crossing that in any way, they will remove you immediately. Okay, and if they feel that you're an individual that is likely to continue, or that has done that more than once, and so on, then they're not going to think twice about it. They're just going to take you out.
Okay? Yeah, well, let's see where that goes.
Yeah.
So if you look at the injections, because we have asserted that there is no public health crisis in the sense that there is a lethal pathogen, So then, of course, an injection couldn't work because there's not the problem to solve to begin with. But do they harm? That is now the question. Do they harm?
Yes.
Do the injections harm?
Yes. So there is no doubt that the injections can kill people and do kill people because it's in VARs. Okay. I am working with a researcher. I'm a volunteer researcher at the Ontario Civil Liberties Association. That's my main kind of connection to an association. And the executive director of that association is a PhD in physics also, and his name is Joseph Hickey. And he has done a deep dive into the VARS data. He's a data scientist by profession, and he's a volunteer executive director of the Ontario Civil Liberties Association. And he's in the process of still doing a deep dive into the VARS data, and he shares his graphs and we discuss it almost daily, okay, because it's so fascinating. It's such a rich database. And what we're seeing is that there, without a doubt, when the vaccine was first rolled out, they were prioritizing elderly people who were considered the most fragile, and without a doubt, they killed a lot of them. That's where the peak in deaths occurred, is until they had vaccinated the target group that they considered most fragile that you could vaccinate, they were killing lots of people. And there's really a hump in time in terms of the date of the death. You can really see it. And the median age in that period is 80 years old. That's the median age. So there is no doubt that when you vaccinate fragile elderly people, you're going to kill a lot of them. A significant number that's very measurable and very obvious in the VARS database. No doubt about it.
Is that due to the content of the injection or the selection of people who get injected?
Well, I would have to say it's most likely a combination of the two. You need both. If you're going to have a death that's going to occur within days of the vaccination, because we also know the distribution of times after injection, at what time did the death occur? And all the deaths that I'm talking about occurred within days of the injection, okay? If you're going to have that, and so a great majority right away on the same day, the next greatest thing is the next day, and then it drops down like that exponentially, okay? So clearly these are deaths that were caused by the fact that they were injected. And clearly this was against a population that the median age was 80 and that were considered to need protection from this wonderful vaccine, okay? And so they definitely, it's the combination. So it's whatever was in there, the fact that they were injected, and the fact that they were all susceptible to dying if you inject them with this product. No doubt about it. Now, what we're also seeing is that one of the manufacturers had a much more lethal product than the other two. Okay, so the Janssen product is much more lethal than Pfizer and Moderna, without a doubt.
So if people are interested, we showed some data of a German research group that does this test with dilutions of the different injections, and you can actually see the batches of cells dying with the addition of the Janssen fluid in a much higher rate, or in a much lower concentration compared to Pfizer or AstraZeneca.
Okay, well, that's interesting. That confirms the finding from VARS. Okay, great. Is that published?
I will send you the copy. It's not officially published, but it's
is
done
it on the internet? Is it made public?
I don't know. I have to check with her.
Okay, yeah. But that if there is such a study, it would be interesting to get it out there, because that's yes. Very interesting. So we're seeing a lot of things in VARS. We're also seeing that following that first exponential drop, there is if you do a log linear graph linear with time, you find a next exponential decay, which is a perfect straight line. It's really exponential. and you continue to have deaths up to 50 days. So you get this first really, really sudden, and then you get this next exponential coming in, and it lasts for 50 days. So, and it's continuous. So I believe that these products maintain their lethality and develop it and enough to kill you for at least 50 days.
That is almost 2 months. So everything that happens within 2 months, you should look at causality by injection.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's what we're finding in the VARS data. This is not published yet. We're writing it. The plan is to write the paper these days. All the graphs and all the data have been analyzed and everything, but we're putting it together and looking at the final things. So that's Joseph Hickey's work. So so that's being done. That's what we see there. Now, those deaths that are reported in VARS, the next question is, okay, what's the report rate? And also, can you see anything in all-cause mortality by age group or whatever? Okay, so we're still analyzing that. I can tell you right now that the signal of extra deaths from the vaccine following the campaign, the very rapid and very intense campaign of vaccination in the United States, you know, you can ask, well, were there more deaths after that campaign and so on? I can tell you right now that if there is a measurable effect, it's small. It's difficult to detect, okay? So in comparison to the massive effect of the measures and the non-response by the medical establishment and the government lockdowns and everything they're doing to us and the stress induced by this craziness in the media and everything, compared to that and completely structurally changing the society and the economy and everything, that the effect of that is massive and is constant and steady since the pandemic was announced up to the present, okay? Compared to that effect, anything that we can detect that would be due to the vaccination campaign in the United States, I'm having a hard time seeing it. I'm still looking, I'm still analyzing, we're still working on it, and we're working on it every day, but right now I can report that it's hard to see. Okay.
And I think this was the point that I was trying to make earlier. So there's two fear bases. One is a lethal pathogen and the other one is a lethal injection. And the reality is, yeah, some people could die from pneumonia and some people have adverse effects and they die. But the reality is that this is an attack on our liberties and we're being scammed. The governments are using funds to buy things we do not need.
I think it's more serious than that, because the harm from the vaccine is more than just the immediate deaths. If there's deaths, there's harm, and there's a lot of harm, and you're injecting everybody, and so you are distributing significant harm in the bodies of virtually everybody, including children. So, and you have partial paralyses, heart problems, you name it, you know, those symptoms, even in VARS, it's a large amount of symptoms and things that are not normally seen with vaccines, you know, especially the heart conditions and so on. And you do have young athletes who are high performing athletes dying on the field everywhere. This is not a large number in terms of all-cause mortality. But if you think of what it means, I mean, I personally on my street in Ottawa, Canada, have a neighbor who is a very athletic person who suffered this, you know. So what I'm trying to say is, I believe that it is criminal to make harm by, and so that's what we're dealing with. So I don't want to minimize it in any way. It's a horrendous crime for a for a situation, like you said, where no special pathogen was arising. So it is one of the major crimes of medicine to have done this campaign. It's up there with the ongoing crime of seasonal flu vaccination, which, as far as I can tell from all the scientific literature that has studied this objectively and seriously, there's no benefit to it. In fact, there are several studies that get highly criticized whenever they come out that show a disadvantage and a harm from vaccinating elderly people in homes with the flu vaccine. Okay.
Absolutely.
So
for me, the flu injection campaign is the precursor of what is happening now.
Yeah, it's the same kind of crime. It's the same kind of abusive nonsense using paid for science to support this. It's obscene. It's obscene. Modern medicine is obscene right now. It's completely obscene. I believe it. And here I'm gonna go a little theoretical on you. It's interesting if you think of it this way. You see, and I wrote a paper about this, a couple of papers about this. You see, we inhabit a dominance hierarchy. And the main determinant of individual health is the oppression that you experience due to that dominance hierarchy. So that means that the physiological response of your body and the attack on your immune system and everything from the stress from the dominance hierarchy actually stabilizes the dominance hierarchy, because it puts all the underlings, if you like, in their place, makes them weaker, less able to challenge the bosses, and so on, right? So if you look at it from that kind of a long perspective, and you look at evolution, it is possible that the immune response to stress from the hierarchy is actually advantageous to the species because it stabilizes the dominance hierarchy. This is the natural state of affairs in animal dominance hierarchies. The lower individuals in the class structure are also not the strongest and don't live as long. But they're needed. It's a full structure, a pack of wolves or whatever. They survive and are successful as a species because of this dominance hierarchy, which is stabilized by this mechanism. Okay, so if we entertain the theoretical possibility of that, which I think I was the first to propose, then medicine is just a technological, modern human extension of that. Medicine is a way to enforce this mechanism whereby the oppression is going to make you sick. It's part of maintaining the social hierarchy. So the medical system is part of maintaining the social hierarchy. It is there to keep you in your place, to keep you dependent, with the belief that your health depends on them and their ability to have science and to intervene when you're sick and so on. It keeps you dependent on them. It reinforces the hierarchy in the same way that organized religion does, in the same way that many things do. So I see medicine as a system of that type, and all the systems of that type can have pathological dysfunction. Okay, so you need some in order to maintain the dominance hierarchy, which is in evolutionary terms advantageous to the species. Okay, but if you have too much, then as a group, as a social group, you become weaker compared to competing social groups that are not that pathological. Okay, so that's why a society like the Western civilizations that distributed decision-making, economic development, invention in science, that distributed that throughout the professions and found a way to get everyone to contribute, was a much stronger, more powerful society than one that is really just has a leader and a bunch of slaves, okay, that is really extreme, that is really totalitarian in the extreme. That is not going to have as much technological development. It's not going to be as successful. It's not going to be as strong and resilient as a network that has a lot of strong, independent-minded individuals, if you like. And I think that Western societies have taken advantage of that, have understood that to a large extent. So you have the system of a system of intellectual property that supports that. You know, the whole idea of copyright, the whole idea of private enterprise. All of these systems create a more stratified society with what we call democracy. And if you make that pyramid sharper and sharper and make the base broader and broader, it becomes weaker. And you can even get to the point where it's pathologically harmful. When the elites have too much effect in determining what the laws are that regulate that dominance hierarchy, and they transform the laws just to their advantage, without an eye to the stability of the dominance hierarchy, then you get a pathological meltdown of the system. Okay, so this can happen, and it does happen, and then it needs to be corrected. And so I can see examples of that in history where this kind of correction has occurred. Now, unfortunately, usually in a healthy, stable democracy, the correction is happening all the time. And there are all kinds of safeguards. So you have the legal profession, and you have the, independent-minded people that look out for this and that and so on. And the designers of really strong, well-structured societies that have this kind of distributed creativity and distributed democracy, basically, they understood this. And so they put in place a constitution, for example, in the United States, that protected individual rights in order to prevent a meltdown of this type. Okay, so the notion of individual rights, of freedom of expression, the right to bear arms, all these kinds of things were intended to prevent the runaway instability of a totalitarian system where you have only people that are oppressed at the bottom, and almost that's all you have, and nobody in the middle, where you got the intermediate levels, And so my understanding is that the Constitution of the United States is this incredibly insightful document that had the intent of stabilizing a society that was already largely like that, where you had many, a wealthy class, an influential class, an owner class. It was distributed. There was not a king above everybody and crushing everybody else and taking their power.
It might be because it was based on the Akte van Verlatingen. It was the constitution of the 7 Dutch republics, so to say. That was one of the basic documents that went into the Constitution of the United States. And it was founded, the Dutch Republic, through merchants, because they split away. So there was already a large wealth distribution. So that could be...
I'm sure that it didn't come out of nowhere. It has a historical context. And these concepts will have been developed throughout history, the history of societies, in human societies, for sure. Because, and I want to inject something else in here. We talked about Joseph Hickey. Joseph Hickey is a physicist who did his PhD on the theoretical physics of the stability of society. Okay. And many of my ideas come from his work, in the sense that his main paper, which is an absolutely important landmark paper that has not yet been recognized enough, is one where he studied when does this hierarchy, when is it stable, under what conditions can it be stable, and when does it devolve into a totalitarian system where you basically have just 1 or 2 people on top and everybody at the bottom with no social status or power or anything. So he found, using fundamental principles, he started with just the nature of individual to individual interactions and built it from there, the simplest possible model, but that is realistic. And he showed the dynamics of a society like that. And he showed a phase diagram of the parameters that control the stability of that society. So he found two, at the first level of analysis, there are two primary parameters that control how quickly you will devolve to a totalitarian system versus stay in that steady state for a long time that is a more democratic state, okay? And so what he discovered was these two parameters were as follows. One is how violent the society is, meaning when you break a rule and the people above you punish you, how violently do they punish you? What price do you pay for going against the dominance hierarchy, okay? So that is the degree of violence in the society. So are you getting a fine or are you being killed? You know, are you being tortured or are you losing something or, you know, being put out of work for a month or something? You know what I mean? How violent the society is. That's one of the important parameters. And the other parameter is what level of domination is there in the society? Meaning, when you go against a powerful institution or a more powerful individual in the society, what is the probability that despite the difference in social status, you can still win sometimes in your particular interaction, in the particular fight that you're having, okay? So if the probability that you can still win is non-zero, then that is a more fair society. And if the probability that you're going to win is essentially zero, as soon as you go against anyone who's moderately above you in the social structure, then that is a very totalitarian society. So that parameter, those two parameters together define a phase diagram. And depending on where you are in the phase diagram, your society is quickly evolving to a totalitarian system or is relatively stable in a democracy. So what he found was that if the society is very violent, you're going to that totalitarian extreme. If the society is very authoritarian, where you just can't win ever, you go to court and you think you're going to have your rights protected, but you never win, then again, you go to that totalitarian extreme. And it's only when you reduce those two parameters enough that you find a domain where, as a function of time, the society can be stable in a non-totalitarian system for a long time. And then he studied the dynamics of how quickly you evolve out of that society, because you're always marching towards totalitarian. That's the general trend that he found, okay? So the time life of the society within this stable hierarchy is something that he studied in his paper. It's a very important paper. So that kind of colors my understanding of how societies are structured. See, I've come to believe that the simple political theories are incorrect. They're unrealistic. So socialism, capitalism, as they're described, are incorrect. What you have to do is recognize that you're an animal society and you are occupying a dominance hierarchy, and that therefore there is always a tendency to go towards totalitarianism, and you have to figure out how to ratchet it back. So when you're adjusting the laws in society, you're adjusting the punishment when you break the law, and you're adjusting the conditions under which, when you have a legal battle or a battle of some kind between corporations and so on, you know, will the most powerful always win, or is there some fairness? The laws that regulate that are laws that, those two things are laws that regulate for the stability of the society. And when the elite are manipulating those laws to their advantage without regard to stability of the society, that's when you get a pathological system that can become totalitarian. And the problem with a totalitarian system is that it can't stay totalitarian forever. A lot of people suffer for a long time, and eventually another society that is less totalitarian discovers the huge competitional benefit of a distributed system, and there's a war and they take you over, or they threaten you enough that you adapt in that direction. So these totalitarian systems, they can last for a long time, you know, but they are ultimately, in a complex world with many societies, they're ultimately not really optimally competitive. And since we are human and we have minds and we can understand this, we can choose a society that is more fair and that is more, more equilibrated and farther from that extreme of absolute slavery and so on.
So we discussed a lot of very interesting topics, sometimes a bit theoretical, but I really like the approach of going wide and zooming in and zooming out. So I hope that we will have another opportunity to elaborate, and also when some papers are published, please come on the show and give us an update. We haven't gone really into the details and the graphs, so we'll keep that for another time. Do you have a wish for the Dutch audience?
Well, I would like you to see my website. Maybe, I don't know, maybe you could show that it exists and what it looks like.
This is the website,
yes.
denisrancourt.ca, and it has a lot of information.
And there's a COVID section there, as you can see. Yep. And that has, if you click that, you'll see the various papers I've written that relate to COVID, whether it's masks, critiques of other studies, and there are, I think, 4 or 5 papers on all-cause mortality of different jurisdictions and so on.
Great. So we'll put it also in the description. It will most likely air on Wednesday the 12th. Thank you again very much for this conversation, and see you soon.
All right, it was my pleasure. Bye now.